All right.
Wow. Tina, do you want to get started, I guess, while people are
Sure.
introducing themselves?
Great. Well, thank you, everyone. We are thrilled to have this group of people gather here today to talk about how the hell we do solutions journalism when we are stuck in our houses and apartments, which is not just a question for a pandemic, but in general, a lot of our news organizations don't have funds for travel. I'd say it's pretty rare one that does. And yet we want to cover responses that are not necessarily in our backyard. So how to do that? So we are going to talk about that today, help provide some useful advice and hear useful from you folks. My name is Tina Rosenberg. I am the co-founder of the Solutions Journalism Network. And with David Bornstein, the other co-founder, we write a column in the New York Times called Fixes, which we've been doing since 2010. And we have no budget for travel or expenses of any kind. So Fixes columns are recorded remotely, unless we happen to be somewhere. But we do basically our reporting remotely. So I've got quite a lot of experience with doing solutions journalism at a remote.
I am Roxanne Patel Shepelavy. I am executive editor and director of the Philadelphia Citizen, which is a 4.5-year-old nonprofit, civic-minded media organization in Philly that pairs solutions journalism with calls to action as a way to jumpstart engagement. So we aim for almost all of our stories to be solution stories or include solutions with as you'll see as we sort of explain what this is, without being Pollyanna-ish, right? So looking at problems in Philadelphia through the lens of a solution. And one of our signature columns is called Ideas We Should Steal. And this is a column that looks at how people in other places have solved problems that we in Philadelphia also share. And then that looks at how that may work here. So we also have zero travel budget. And so those stories are really all done remotely. And have sort of have become a really rich catalog of solutions that can work to work on problems that we have here. So today we're going to go through a few things. Tina's going to give us, walk us quickly through what solutions journalism is and the 4 elements of them. And how you can sort of achieve that even if you're not there in person. We're going to give you a little exercise on brainstorming how to report a solution story from your house. And then we're going to give you some tips from the work that we have done on how we are doing solutions journalism stories remotely. So what is solutions journalism? It is rigorous, evidence-based reporting on responses to social problems. It covers a response to a problem and how it happened, provides evidence of impact, looking at the effectiveness, not just the intentions. It produces insights that can help others respond to, and it points out any limitations or caveats of the response.
Just to add a little bit onto that, there's a lot of things that are in those 4 qualities of covering a response, looking at evidence, providing insights, and covering limitations. A lot of things are not included in that. It's not how-to stories. It's not stories about how you, the reader, or our news organization can become part of the solution. It's not the journalist recommending things or predicting things or theoretical things that are being proposed. It is just covering the news, but the news is how someone is responding to a problem and what results they're getting from it. Roxanne?
Okay. So solution stories ask who's doing it better, and this is a sort of an interesting thing and maybe a little bit different from what people often do if we're reporting on our local communities. We look at places where something is happening that is done better. And so one of the stories that we talk about, and I don't know if there's a link in here that people were able to do it, but there is a Spanish language newspaper in, Tina, remind me where it is?
North Carolina.
North Carolina. That in March 25th, I was going to say the early days of this, and it's weird that that's only a couple weeks away, but I think that is the early days. Sort of looked around to find out, where is the coronavirus having less of an impact than in other places. The headline of the story tells you exactly what the story is, and so what they did was they and this story is written not as a narrative. This is really much more a bulleted point of the different things that South Korea did in order to sort of limit the effect of the coronavirus. And so the story basically says, that they explain these, I think it's 4 Gs, in social distancing and rapid testing. And actually the story is fascinating if you can read it, because one of the things they talk about in the beginning is that South Korea learned from the MERS outbreak from 2015 that they needed to change public policy around rapid testing. And so as soon as COVID-19 hit, they started rapidly testing their population. And so they were able to do more than 10,000 tests a day. And so the story explains how that worked. It explains a couple of other things that they did. And then it comes back and it asks, well, what about in the United States? So, is there rapid testing here? How do we that were learned there and apply them to what we are doing here and can do here? And that's where they interviewed some professors in Seattle and DC and tried to understand a little bit of how you take what the reporter learned about South Korea and applies it to what's happening in the United States. And what's interesting about the way it worked, I thought, was that it also it does this thing where it tells you what is what's possible and sort of why it will not work, which I think is important to include.
The limitations, yes.
Yeah.
So that's really important about solution stories is that even though the real subject of the story is the idea, the strategy they bring, these stories all have people in them, as every good story does. Characters are used perhaps in a different way. Sometimes you can show the characters at work. Here's what they did, didn't work out, too much political opposition. Then they tried something else. So that didn't work out. Then they tried something else. So you're showing a narrative with your characters, not just them with static quotes, but you're showing them doing the work, which is the real hero. Now this story by Alicia in Health News is a very great example of that, which is about a clinical trial, I think the first NIH clinical trial for a COVID cure, told through the point of view of 2 members of a husband and wife who've been married for 62 years, I think, and both participated in this trial. And it's really their story and a great way of telling a solution story. So the South Korea story was an example of a fairly one on the drier side. Yeah. This is an example of a story that's on the richer side in terms of characters. And there's a place for both of them. So the big question, how do you get all these elements without being there? And how do you determine, for example, whether actually a story you should be reporting? You're not there on the ground to see it. So how, if it's something that works, if it's something that's important? That's one question. How do you communicate to the reader what it feels like and looks like and sounds like to be there? How do you find sources that are on the ground, people who can tell you about their experiences from their own points of view? And then how do you make sure you gather a variety of perspectives, various people on various sides of the issue? What other questions are there that we have to answer? Can you put in the chat a couple of questions? We'll wait for a minute while people do that. Remember, all panelists and all attendees. What other questions do we have? All right, well, I guess we've covered all those questions. So what is it is one question. Why should an editor hire you to write this when they're journalists on the ground in the area? How does one find these solutions in other places? I'm sorry, what the chat was.
It says, how do you determine how many people you should contact? Right, without being too extreme, but just getting that perfect number. That's a good question. How do you information? Could you speak in some detail on how they guide a phone conversation to elicit details? So you'll see some of that when we go through the story that we are that they're annotated that we did.
Some questions to guide people through describing a scene. That's a good question.
Yeah.
Do you tell the interviewee explicitly that you're looking for sensory detail and chronology? I never think to do this, but now I'm imagining something like, since I can't be there, I need you to help me really see the event.
Totally. Yeah. I think there's never reason not to do that.
Time to conduct phone interviews that elicit scene details. Do you build in extra time? All right, a lot of these are great questions. Oh, they're all great questions. But let's start with basics. And can we go back to the slide, please? Okay. So one of the important issues of doing a story remotely is that you do a hell of a lot of work before you go anywhere, right? You're not going to get on a bus or a train or get in your car before you've determined this is a story for you. It's got a very high chance of working out. Before you know exactly where you're, before you have a good list of people you're going to talk to, it would be a foolish waste of resources to just go without making all those determinations, right? So all those are things that you have to answer before you even travel. So when you're doing a solution story remotely, you're going to work on doing all those things. Next slide. Can we go past that for a second, Jules?
Oh, there you go.
No.
You had it. I think it's 13, 14, 15, 16. Yeah.
All right, so you're gonna, before we travel, we're gonna find through the data and other to make sure that the idea we have story, you're gonna make sure that the story is a good place where we wanna go to see it. It's a good example. You're gonna make of people you're gonna talk to and maybe even make a schedule for yourself, and you're gonna plan your trip. So what we suggest doing is do all those things. Next slide. Next slide, and then just don't go.
Right.
Okay, you still prep work. The question is, what do we have to make up for when we don't go? And it's basically three things. Let me just say, Roxanne, I know you'll agree with this.
Yeah.
It is not ideal to report. It doesn't matter if you can go.
Right.
However, it's just not possible in a lot of cases, and we don't want to give up these kinds of stories just because we can't go. So obviously this is second best. But when we don't, we miss a couple of things. We miss being able to show people what it feels like and looks like on the ground.
Right.
We miss doing a ride along. Along means like, I'm going to go out with these as they go out for the night and social services to people. And then we miss anything that we don't know is going to happen, unexpected. All right, so let's look at how we make up for those things.
Yeah.
Now we go to the annotated story. Is that right?
Yeah, so we can, so Jules, do you want to go back to the annotated stories? Great.
Okay. I don't know if folks got a chance to read this, but this was a story that I did about a gun violence prevention program in Newburgh, New York, that I did not travel for. And let's just look at, I just want to very briefly hit some of the ways that I tried to make up for that. So the first thing that I did was ask the people present at a very important meeting to describe what that was like. And I got various different people to talk about it. I didn't quote all of them, but I asked them, and I asked them about details. I asked them very specifically to talk about what the scene looked like, what was said, what people's reactions, describe particular people, up at titles. By the way, our colleagues Jules Hotz and Linda Shaw are on the call, and they are on this webinar, and they're helping out too. So go up a little, please. We'll just mention a Pete. A little more. A little more. All right, so some guys look like they're bored to death, she says. So she's how this doesn't work, buddy. And then there's important details like the food. We had wraps, salad, and brownies, something nice. We have it catered, not pizza. These kinds of tiny details are really important in making the scene more vivid for the reader. Okay, let's keep going. We want to get to specifically what addresses the problem of remote reporting. Keep going. Okay, so evidence for this idea. I know that this was a good program to write about and that Newburgh was a good place to set it. The reason was that I had done a lot of research. This particular program, which is goes by the name of Ceasefire, is one of the most studied forms of violence prevention. It is largely, has overwhelming evidence that it's very successful. And in Newburgh, it has both been successful and unsuccessful, which is why I thought this was an interesting place to set it there. But I had done that research before I went. How did I learn about Ceasefire? Just by looking up, talking to people about violence prevention. The same way we learn about stories that are not remote. Okay, keep going down, please, Jules. Okay, so after talking about Newburgh for a while, stop. I talked about some other cities. It was important to put Newburgh into context. So I had stuff from Oakland, California, quite a few paragraphs about Oakland. I mentioned what was going on in Detroit and Pittsburgh. It's very important, especially when you're remote, to lay the panorama, give people a sense of the whole scope of what's going on. Situate the response you're talking about in the larger panorama. Okay, keep going. Okay, so here's another recreated scene where the police and the DA's office were knocking on visiting families and talking to them. And once again, I was not there. Chances are, even if I was there, they would not have let me go along with something like this. This is one of the issues that you're often not missing the ride along because you can't get to do the ride along. And if you can get to do it, it's often more staged because you're a journalist and you're there writing about it. So, just by your presence, you're altering it. So sometimes what we think might be happening if we were on the ground isn't necessarily all that great either. So I'm not missing that much by not being there. So I asked people to recreate this scene. And then I went to statistics showing what was the success in Newburgh. Keep going. Okay, and then we talked about the limitations, how it had not worked in Newburgh and other places when tried in the beginning. Very important to point out that and talk about what these places are now doing differently. All right, so let's go to Roxanne's. I'm going to go back and take a look at what these questions are since they went by me very quickly, and I'm going to write them down while Roxanne is talking.
So I did a story, Ideas We Should Steal story for the Citizen about reducing poverty. And this sort of answers, this sort of speaks a little bit to what Tina mentioned before, which is poverty, Philadelphia, if you don't know it, is the poorest big city in America. 26% of our population lives in poverty here. So this is sort of an overriding topic with kind of everything that comes up in Philadelphia. And so, I've spent a lot of time thinking about and looking at how, what are some of the answers? There's, millions upon millions of dollars spent on organizations in Philadelphia to fight poverty, but we can't seem to change that number. And so in doing research about programs that have worked in places, I came across this program out of Canada run by the Tamarack Institute and this gentleman named Paul Bourne. And it was one of those things where it is like overwhelmingly a success. It is not dissimilar from Ceasefire, which has been, you know, successful all over the place. In Canada, as it says here, they lifted 200,000 families out of poverty in 7 years, and then it was so successful they stopped counting. And so I immediately called, you know, I got in touch with Paul Bourne, and you know, there's no way that I was going to be able to fly to Toronto to find out, you know, how he did this. And there were, you know, and to have been able to really witness it, I would have had to be there for months, really, to really see how these programs unfolded, and I would have been able to do that. So in order to do this story, I would always have to have done it from a distance, to even if I were, you know, I would still have to be going back and really over the phone finding out more information. So I started my story by with this anecdote that Paul Bourne told me about working for a fighting organization and having been determined to be really successful, but then realizing that there were actually more people who were poor than not poor when he started this. And he recognized that in any other world, this would be considered a failure. And so he quit his job and he tried to come up with a different way, which spoke to me to this issue that we have in Philadelphia, which is that all these organizations are trying to solve poverty and we still have a lot of poverty. So you can scroll up. Yeah. So here I laid out pretty clearly how successful the program is. That's in the subhead too, but it was, you know, that again is like, it's so striking, and there's lots of reports, there's a lot of evidence around how they did this and where it has worked in all different parts of Canada. Okay. Things that is really important in these kinds of stories, and you know, I'm a local journalist in Philadelphia, and so everything I'm writing about has to refer back to Philadelphia. And one of the things that I always have to consider is, if this works somewhere else, how does that even mean it would work here? And so where I'm acknowledging that in fact Canada is a different place than the United States, and you know, making the point that not every solution works, or, and I think this is key, it doesn't always work the same way everywhere. But as it turns out, Tamara is also doing work in central Iowa, which is very different from Philadelphia in many ways, but is similar to Philadelphia also in these ways I mentioned. It has a lot of young people moving there, jobs are growing, it has a lot of immigration, and it has 33% of its population living below the poverty line. And that led me to kind of the next series of calls that I made, which were to people in central Iowa to help me understand, you know, I understand how this, you know, what happened in Canada, but help me explain how in an American system with a very different social welfare system. Okay, you can go down. So I talked to Elizabeth Buck. I talked to a few different people. Again, I didn't quote everybody who I talked to, but this is again a little bit of setting the scene. So Paul Bourne had already told me how they set up these day and a half long workshops. So I had in my head sort of generally going to be, and then time finding out exactly what went on in this room. And I didn't include every detail because there's, you know, part of it is I spent that time on the phone so that I would understand it and be able to filter through what I'm going to include, which is what we would do in person anyway. And then this is a detail that's similar to the pizza detail, right, in Tina's story, which is, I was really struck by this piece of conversation that I learned about, which was when this businessman said he didn't know anybody living in poverty, and somebody pointed out that he probably interacts with people living in poverty all the time, including his barista. And that was sort of a little bit resonant, I thought. And so that, and it was, the way it was described to me, it was really one of these sort of pivotal aha moments for the people in the room. Okay. So again, there were these specific examples of how this program worked. So in some ways, this process story, because as you'll see further down, I talk about exactly how this solution works. But in this case, I really wanted to understand some of the examples of what kinds of changes did you make. And so I laid some of those out. And recognize that, you know, what I don't include in my story are people who are living that experience. But this was a story about the Tamarack and their solution, and so that wasn't a piece of what I included. So I didn't need to have that piece on the ground either. Okay. So Paul Bourne was a really engaging person to talk to on the phone, and in some ways, he's sort of your ideal phone interview because he likes to tell stories, didn't take a lot of time, and has this sort of evangelist way of speaking, which makes great, really great copy here. I included this piece. This again really struck me, where he talked about looking at the problem in a totally different way than we think about it. So Jules, can you go up a little bit so people can see? No, good. Yeah, so people can see that. So the quote that was there was where he talked about, you know, 85% of people, for 85% of people in America, the system works, right? So 15% of people, or, you know, whatever that number is, 25% of poverty, the other 75% are actually not. They're actually to some degree. And that there is a way that you can just incrementally be more successful with more people. And that sort of framing of a problem, I thought was a really important piece of this story. And then can you scroll down so people can see? No, other way. Yeah. So here's one of those things that I would have seen in his face if I was looking at him in person. And I think it could also work if I was looking at him over Zoom or one of these or some other sort of video conferencing way. I could hear his voice, and I could hear what sounded like anger, but he's really joyful. And so it's that little detail that is one of those things that you can miss when you're not looking at somebody in person. But I was able to, you know, that was one of those things that in the course of talking to him and sort of being a little bit taken aback by his fervor, that he was able to say, you know, I'm really smiling when I'm talking to you. Okay. So here I don't really need to explain. This is really just explaining how the system works. And then I came back to, you were right, you can go back up where you were. Yes, so this is, here I talked, if you go, I'm sorry, Jules, can you go down again? No, yeah, this way. So here we talk about, okay. Go down. So lower down in the story. Yeah. Okay. So here I talk about Philadelphia, right? So this story, again, because I'm a local publication, so I spent a lot of time in Canada. I spent time in Iowa. I talked about the process of how he does, and then I had to bring it back to Philadelphia. And so, you know, this is for all of us who sort of do local journalism, right? We know our local communities. And so I'm able to talk about how this solution would work in Philadelphia, what it would take to work in Philadelphia. And then towards the end of the story, I mentioned that the new leader of our United Way here, similar to in Iowa, is taking on poverty as the issue and is going to be doing something similar in Philadelphia. And I have sort of up to show that, you know, we've seen it work in other places, and so we can maybe make it work here too. Great.
Great. So should we go through some of the questions?
Yeah, this is Linda Shaw breaking in here. I've been watching the chat. There's been a lot of great questions on the chat, and I've tried to compile some of the most common ones. So would it be helpful if I just asked you guys and you can address some of them?
Yeah, that'd be great.
Perfect.
Yes. Some of them are, a lot of them are around verification. When you're not there, how over the phone and through video do you know how to trust the people you're talking to, verify the information that you're getting? You know, how do you, so that's one question.
Okay. Well, video is better than phone. And it's good to be able to spend a lot of time on a call. Think of all the time you're saving by not traveling. So you spend some of that by making your calls longer, put people more at ease, you get more interesting stuff towards the end, just let them talk. You don't have to sort of say, oh, no, next question, next question, next question. And the way you verify is by triangulation. You're going to talk to as many different people as you can. And, you know, I would, if I'm talking about a program, I'm going to want people that I can talk to in an area who work for it, who are clients of it, who are critics of it, who maybe have not benefited from it, but you want all those people to talk to. And so you're going to find people who can introduce you to those people on the ground. Most of the time, if you go somewhere, that's how you're going to find your sources anyway, unless it's a geographically contained story. If you're writing about a housing project, then you can go knock on doors and talk to people randomly, but it's very hard to do that on a lot of stories. You're not going to find people randomly or on street corners. You're going to be setting up appointments and going to see people. And you can do all that on a video call or on the phone instead. So the important thing really is a wide variety of sources.
Agreed. And the other great thing about a wide variety of sources is that some of the color that you miss by being in person, you get by having a wide variety of sources. And so if you have 3 people talking about the same meeting, you might have 3 different details that stood out to them that you maybe would have seen, or maybe you wouldn't have seen all of them, right? Everybody sort of brings a different piece to that.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of questions about how can you be sure your sources are being reliable and honest and trust people over the phone. That's a question all the time, even when you're in person with them.
Another common question was, you know, when you're not talking with someone in person, how do you put your sources at ease if they're afraid to talk for one reason or another? Are there some tips you guys have for how to do that virtually?
You know, it's a hard question. I think that's a hard question. It's difficult in person too. And I get that if you're in person, there is a person, you know, the person you're talking to has a much greater sense of you and sense of comfort. I think video is a much better way to do that than phone. I think you want people to be able to see your expressions and see what you look like and have a sense of you. I also think I think that telling people about me and the work that I've done and why I'm interested in their story is really important, because I think mostly people want to tell their stories, but I feel like sometimes they don't understand or they don't trust why the questions are being asked. And what I've often found is if I really explain what I am trying to understand, that people are more inclined to want to help me understand it.
Okay. There's also some great questions about, you know, how much do you tell your audience in the story that you reported remotely? How much do you disclose about that, and how?
Yeah, it can get cumbersome to be constantly saying that, as one of the questioners pointed out. First of all, your story will not have a dateline. If it's a dateline, it'll say like Detroit and then start your story. So you won't have that because you didn't go there. Of course, most readers have no idea what that means. So you do things like, he told me in a phone interview, or he said over a video chat, And you don't have to do that all the time, but an occasional just reminder that these interviews were conducted remotely is what you need, I think.
Yeah, or you can do it the first time you reference each of the people you talk to, but you don't have to mention it later, because so the opposite question could also be asked, because sometimes your experience shapes going to a place, and so you don't necessarily want to say, and I was in the ride along, and it's implied that you are, but there's little clues that you give to whether you're in the ride along or whether you're learning about it later. And it can do it subtly. I think that's fine. As long as you feel confident and your readers can feel confident that you have done your due diligence, then you don't need to hammer them over the head with it.
There were some questions from TV reporters and photographers about how to do this. I think for a photographer, it's really hard to do without being there.
Yeah.
And in fact, one of the advantages I have at the New York Times is that I can report a story remotely, but the Times can commission a picture from anywhere because they have this network of freelancers.
Yeah.
So that is a big advantage that I know that most people do not have. TV, I don't know much about TV, but I understand that we are going to be having a webinar about TV reporting very soon. Is that right, Linda?
That's right.
Yep, that's right.
Great.
One of the other questions was, people wanted you to talk a little bit more about how you get the details to reconstruct a scene when you're not there.
So I ask a million questions, and I am really in favor of keeping people on the phone as long as I can, because one of the things I find is that the longer people are on the phone, the more comfortable they are, and the more you sort of get these little details that you wouldn't necessarily know to ask for. So I don't know if Tina said, to the people on the phone, hey, what kind of food did you serve, right? But it's sort of like when you're trying to sort of get at what's there, you find yourself asking questions just to sort of understand it better, and asking people to tell it as prompting people to tell the story. Tell me what it was like in the room. What were people talking about? What did they say? Or whatever it is that sort of elicits from them anecdotes. Because sometimes when they have anecdotes, it either prompts you to ask a question about that, or the anecdote itself gives you the details that you need.
And you can really, think about all sort of ways you would want to be able to describe it and ask about those. What were people wearing? What did they do when they first came in? Did they talk to each other before sitting down? What kinds of conversations did they have? How did people feel about answering the questions there? What food did you serve? What did the room look like? What color were the curtains and the floor? And then you can ask questions that are more general but can elicit these sort of things. Did anything happen that surprised you? Do you remember specifically the story of any person that struck you and really stayed with you? Can you tell me that story? What were the most typical ways people behaved, and what were some untypical ways people behaved? You need time to ask these questions, but if you can get people talking, then you can have very rich interviews.
Yeah, I don't think you need to shy away from asking the questions that maybe seem insignificant in compared to the larger story, but those are the way you get those details. And it is also a way, it's also a way of setting people at ease, frankly, because when they start to talk about these sort of details, then they're just talking to you, and the more they talk to you, the more comfortable they get. So when they start to set the scene of what people were wearing and what they were eating, they're starting to feel you understand what you're doing too.
There's a question, can you really describe the curtains if you're not there? Do you mean ethically, can you describe the curtains if you're not there? I think the answer is yes, you can, because you're just trying to give the reader a picture of what it looked like. Let's say you ask 3 people what color the curtains are, and they all said they're brown. You can ethically say, in the brown curtain room, it doesn't matter whether you were actually present or not. That's not the point of the story. The point is to tell people what it looked like and what it felt like.
Great. And there's one other common question, but I think people are putting follow-ups in the chat, which is great, because there's many of you on this webinar and we can't find it. If I've forgotten your question, please put it in the chat again so it's at the top and we can see it. One other common question was how you get story leads anyway without being out and about, and why are you a good person to tell the story if you're far away from it, if that's clear enough. In other words, someone asked, actually, Roxanne, why didn't you get a reporter on the ground to do the story that you're talking about instead of trying to do it remotely?
I don't have the money to hire a reporter on the ground. I don't have any reporters in Toronto. So I think a lot of people will find that they don't have the ability to send people to a place, right? To be on the ground. And again, the other thing with the story is it was describing something that would take place over a very long period of time. And so could I have had somebody on the ground at that particular meeting? Sure. But it wouldn't have actually been able to cover what the story was about anyway. I couldn't, right? I couldn't describe what happened over the course of months or weeks or years. And so I had to figure out a way of telling that story without being there. So I think it's always great if you can get somebody who can show up to all of these places. If I could have had a reporter who was there in Iowa over months to write that story, but I would have had to have that person, I would have had to know that that would be a successful program to write about when I sent them before it started, which would have been, I would have had to sort of anticipate what my story was going to be 2 years ahead of time, which I couldn't do. And the other question about, Tina, maybe you can take this one. How do you know that you're the right person to cover it?
Well, there's probably always someone who's better to cover it than you, or better to cover it than me, but it's a story. I mean, I have to write a story, so I'm going to cover something. It's great if you can have somebody write it on the ground, but we have no budget for freelancers either. A lot of places don't anymore, and a lot of times, it's your work. You are coming to work that day, and you are going to be doing a solution story. Now, sometimes you can ask people on the ground to help you. Would you please take out your phone and take some video for me so I can see what it looks like? Or if somebody's working at an organization, you can ask them to go up to somebody and be, a translator for conversations for you. People will help you out. Or you can talk to a journalist in that city and have a swap. But if this is your story and you have to do it, then you have to do it. Why don't we go back to the slides, and we can still be talking about these issues, but let's go back to the slides if we can, Jules. Thanks.
Roxanne, you want to introduce this one?
We can't see it, Jules.
I can't see it. Yeah, sorry. Oh, sorry. That's why we were waiting. I still have my story up there.
Huh. Okay. Sorry about that.
That's okay.
Okay.
There we go. Okay.
So we thought that one of the ways that we could sort of help illustrate the points that we're making is to introduce an exercise and sort of ask you all to chime in with some of your suggestions. So here it is. It says, say you're a journalist, which you are, and you're given a tip about a nonprofit in another city successfully addressing a socioeconomic consequence of COVID-19. So, what would your first steps be? How would you approach trying to understand the story and trying to report the story? What do you guys think? Yep. So do some research on it, call the director. Sure, yeah, so find somebody who's there, yeah.
Okay, what else do you want to do besides talking to the organization itself? Who would you want to talk to?
Yes, I'm reading, let's see, Megan Cameron. So you said,
That's a
Yeah, audio, yeah.
private conversation. Okay.
Okay.
Try to find some Facebook connections, do a clip search.
Yeah, talk to who they've helped, the beneficiaries. Yeah, that's great. And
look to see stats in my own city.
Yep, that's great.
On social media, all those things. I would try and find somebody who has a broad view, an expert in the subject, and ask that person if they know about this organization and what they think of it, and they have a comparative perspective, or someone who studies that. There's people who've written their PhD theses on everything you can possibly imagine. So there's always experts.
I would also try to find a local, a local expert or official or somebody who you trust who could tell you whether that would work in your city or not, in your locale.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you could just write about it working somewhere else, but you want to bring it home a little bit too. And I think asking local nonprofits about it is a good approach too, because you may learn is that it was tried in your city and it didn't work, or that somebody is looking into it, or that you can get a richer sense of it.
Okay. Yeah.
Great. Something that makes sense. Yeah. So yeah, right. So compare it to your own city, right? So make those caveats that it may not work in your city but it may work in your city because.
Right. It's cheating if the reason it works is that the city that it's in is rich. That's not a solution story.
That is always our problem when we compare things to New York, right? So things that work in New York, there's always the caveat of, but New York is, has a lot more money. So to compensate for a sense of place, did you want to take this?
Sure. I mean, we've gone over this.
Yeah.
You can ask people to help you by taking video and showing you what it looks like. You're going to try and talk to people with as many different point of views as possible, and then interview people on video calls and be prepared to spend a long time on the interviews so you can ask them lots of different questions. Okay. Next.
So we also talked about this a little bit, right? Ask various participants with different viewpoints to tell you the same story. So you want the people who run the nonprofit, you want the people who are helped by it, you want people who maybe weren't helped by it, you want some experts. All of those are really important pieces to get. Somebody here said, talk to other journalists who may have covered the story and have some other context. That's great. That doesn't necessarily go into your story, but I think that's good for background.
That's a really good point. A lot of this doesn't go into your story. It goes into your head.
Yeah, because some of it is just confirming what you've learned from other people, right? It's when it's refuting that, then you maybe have to do more reporting, but oftentimes you're going to get the same story. Get strong details by asking a million questions, staying on the phone. And I think this is a really good point, right? So there are some things that you can attend. You can do in-person interviews, of course. And you can attend some things and just be a fly on the wall, but often you are influencing what's happening and you're really not getting a true look at what would happen if you weren't there.
So we have a question about how do you get story ideas if you can't be out and about? And that's a good question. But so how do we simulate being out and about? And I'm not sure what out and about means. I mean, I don't get a lot of story ideas by walking around places. I tend to get story ideas by reading things, by talking to people. I can walk around places, but only after I know it's a story and I have an idea that I need to be there. It's not a you're not going to take a random walk to drum up story ideas. So you can replace the out and about by making a point of talking to as many people as you can all the time. That's unfortunately going to be the best you can do.
And I think if you're trying to, I think there's a difference between the sort of stories that you just happen upon by talking to people and they say, oh, hey, this is happening, and the stories where you're trying to find a solution for something in particular, right? And so I think that really requires doing, calling the people who are the experts and doing the research into other places. And a lot of that doesn't happen by pounding the pavement, right? A lot of that happens by making the right calls to people to sort of to figure out that solution that you're looking for.
Okay. Next slide.
So, you know, this again is, this sort of speaks to some of the questions that people had, right? Where you want to talk to multiple sources. You know, looking at other locales, so this sort of is that if it works in one place, doesn't mean it's going to work anywhere else. And then bearing in mind that, you know, the stuff that makes the narrative, that is the color of the story, is not the story itself, right? The story itself is what the solution is, what the problem is, how it's being approached, how it works, what the data shows. And so I think we can get a little bit hung up in trying to make sure that you have that you've been to every single thing that you're talking about, when, you know, the story itself is somewhere else.
So I think the next slide has a lot to say about how to get stories, which is find positive deviance. There's two ways that I've used to find stories for solutions journalism stories. One is I hear about an organization that's doing something good. It can be an NGO, it can be a city government, it can be a hospital, it can be a business, but you hear about, oh, here's a possible solution, and I want to look into whether, in fact, is what they're doing newsworthy? Are they having, is it interesting enough to write about? Is it successful enough that it justifies writing about? That's the most common way people find stories. There's some perils there because sometimes you're not always in a good position to evaluate claims that people make about themselves. The other way to do it, and this is something I like a lot, is to find a positive deviant. I think about a problem and I cut it into really small pieces. And each of those small pieces is an important chunk of the problem. For example, let's take COVID-19. There's an infinite number of sub-problems for COVID-19, but let's think of some that right now are coming up a lot. One is the racial imbalances in who is getting sick and who's dying. Another is the perils of living at home if you have an abusive domestic partner. Another is people are having a lot of trouble signing up for unemployment compensation, and if you don't have a computer in your house, it's particularly hard to do. There's endless numbers of these. So then what you do is you take the smallest slice you can and you find out who's doing a better job against that slice. Is there a place where the racial disparities are narrower than they are other places in who's getting sick and who's dying? Is there a place that is having policies that may be successful? One of the issues with COVID is there's just not enough evidence for anything. It's too new and too fast moving. So you have to say that. I'm going to write about this because it seems interesting and important, but of course we don't know yet whether it's successful or not. Is there a place that's doing better on helping people who are maybe stuck in their houses with abusive spouses? Is there a place that's figured out how to let people apply for unemployment compensation from their smartphones, or how about from a flip phone? So you're going to try and find the positive deviant, which we define as someone who's doing better than the others with similar resources. That is my favorite way of finding a solutions journalism story. Then once you've found that, then you're going to look for the specific place you can set your story.
Yeah.
Roxanne, you want to add to that?
What question?
Any of the positive deviant stuff? Because
Oh,
use that
no,
too.
I think that's I was saying to Tina when we were talking about this earlier that I didn't know the phrase positive deviant, and I hadn't realized that is sort of the approach that I take sometimes when I'm looking for stories like how to solve poverty or one of these sort of really big problems, but breaking it down and looking at each of the sort of squares in the grid is a really interesting way of approaching that. And it also means that, you know, the problem of trying to find solutions to big problems like COVID-19 is that there is no solution to COVID-19, right? There are solutions that are being found for the different pieces of it, for different populations. And that's where you can actually find a story, right? You can actually write something then.
And Jody, yes, that means the positive deviant approach does start with the problem.
Yeah.
Small slice of the problem, and then look for who's doing better on that. Yeah. All right, so we have very few minutes left, like 2. So what other questions can we answer, Linda, that have been asked by many people?
I think I covered most of them. Is there anyone that didn't get their burning question answered? Type it in right now.
You know, I will say that one of the things I think we're learning and having to learn, because we're all in our homes, is how to do all of this stuff remotely, right? And I think that I think a lot more of your sources are also going to be, assuming they have access to the internet and computers, are going to be much more open to doing this kind of a conversation, even when we're no longer in isolation. And so doing remote reporting may actually get easier just because it's now a part of our lives. Let's see.
That's right, and that'll probably stay that way afterwards to some
Yeah,
degree.
I mean, I think it will. Let's see, are there other questions here? Let's see.
Will the recording be shared?
People who please fill out the survey that Jules just dropped in the chat. We would love to hear your feedback on this session as we do more of them to make them better.
I think survey is sort of it's just a couple questions. It's very quick.
Yeah, it's just 2 questions. And if you feel like you didn't have your question answered or you're looking for a specific resource, that's a great place to put all that there.
The readers say they can't copy the survey from here, which
it's just in the chat right here. And I'll send it out again in an email with these slides, the recording, and everything.
Yeah. So the positive deviant, how do you find the place that's doing it? You look through databases, you ask experts. You want people who have a comparative, broad view to be able to say, they're doing something interesting in Omaha, or here in San Diego, they've got this program, or here's a database from New York State that shows all of the hospitals. So starting a positive deviant approach usually means access to data that's widespread.
And you can look at other publications that may have written about something that hints at it, that you can then go do the research for to have somebody. You just sort of need to have a few places that you can, a few ideas that you can then chase down, I guess is what I'm trying to get to.
Mike DeWine is a walking positive deviant. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you.
Yeah, great. Thank you all so much for joining us. I hope this was helpful. And I think if there are any other questions, I think there's a way here that you can put them in and we can try to answer them.
Really appreciate it.
Great.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye, everybody. Good luck and stay safe.